We're into round 5 of the FIDE World Cup knockout tournament. 16 players left. Now, they had game 1 of round 5 yesterday, and that was quite a placid round. There were 7 draws and just 1 decisive game. Now, this second game, well, it was all going on as the players were bidding to get into the final 8. And I want to show you the second game between Arjun Erigaisi and Levon Aronian. Now, in their first game, actually, that was fascinating. They really went for it. It burnt out to a draw finally. But it showed how both players are so adventurous. You know, they just have that little bit of sort of grit in the oyster where they don't mind playing something that's, you know, a little bit offbeat, quite tricky, and they both love attacking. So this second game lived up to expectations. Levon Aronian playing white and Arjun Erigaisi playing black. It's an intriguing one. You know, Aronian, 43 years old, but on pretty good form. Of course, you know, he's been rated over 2,800. He's won the World Cup on 2 previous occasions, 2005 and 2017. So we know he can do it. He knows he can do it. And then Erigaisi, just 22 years old. I mean, it's extraordinary. They're from different generations, actually. But he's such a good prospect. And, well, as many of the favourites are leaving the World Cup, India is pinning their hopes on him and on Pentala Harikrishna as well. So this was a really interesting game too. Hope you enjoy. Aronian opened with e4, and the game went into a gioco piano like this, and d3. So it's a very tense position. No exchanges take place for a very long time, and you know, there's a lot of manoeuvring. And white has, you know, different options here. Now, Aronian played very traditionally with knight d2. You can also play bishop g5. I've discussed that pin on quite a few occasions in related games. But knight d2 is absolutely normal. And after bishop e6, instead of exchanging pieces, Aronian kept more tension with bishop b5. So sometimes it's nice to damage the pawns. It could be that white can get in d4 and d5 if black is careless. So that's why bishop a7 was played. In fact, it's a very theoretical position. Queen b8 has been played before. But anyway, bishop a7 is typical, just withdrawing the bishop. Knight f1. Aronian plays in standard fashion, just manoeuvring the knight over. And Erigaisi went for also a very well-known manoeuvre. So this knight is moving over to g6. So after d4, so Aronian got this in, finally. And knight g6, so that holds the tension. Black wants to keep that strong point on e5. So the knight supports it, and of course the knight is far more stable on g6 than c6. More than that, sometimes it might even have the chance to go on the attack. So knight g3, both players playing the same way. But white is slightly better here. I mean, it's a really tense position. Why is white slightly better? Because white just has a little bit more space with those pawns on d4 and e4 instead of d4 and e6. And white has to decide, you know, what do you do? Do you want to push on? Do you want to exchange? Or do you want to just hold the position as it is? And the same with black. Does black want to just hold it or exchange on d4? The moment exchanging on d4 just doesn't look good, because then white has a really nice centre. So for the moment it's best just to hold the position. Erigaisi went bishop g4. So what would happen if black just played h6, for example? This was actually played in the game but in Germany in 2024. Victor Bologan playing white schlecht, playing black. And Bologan went c4. So you can see that white has this really nice space advantage. It's a little bit like a King's Indian, except the bishop is on a7 and not on g7. But I like white's space advantage here. You know, you can do so much. You just have more options, and you can try and squash your opponents like this. So that's why Erigaisi wanted to put a little bit of pressure on this diagonal, but basically on the d4 pawn. This is the point. So that now there is a threat to exchange here. And white definitely doesn't want to recapture with the g-pawn when this knight is lurking on the king side. So bishop e3 supports this pawn. And Erigaisi went for it. He exchanged on d4 and d5, so he releases the tension. Now, white certainly does not want to exchange here, because that leaves the knight on a beautiful square. Just this black structure looks better than white's here. Not such a nice isolated d-pawn. So I would say this next move is almost forced. I think white has to push on, actually. And the knight came back to e8. So we've got a fixed structure. Bishop e2 and f6. So very important for white. So excuse me, for black to break down white's strong point on e5. So getting rid of this means that white won't be able to get some kind of, you know, 4-3 rolling pawn majority here. So really that pawn can't remain on e5, it has to exchange itself off. And queen b3 played. Attacking down here, so an exchange and queen d7. Okay, well let's sum up the position, because now that the pawn structure has stabilized, it's possible to take stock and sum up where we are. White has two bishops. Knight looks pretty good on g3, looking at some important squares. But how good are those bishops? You know, that bishop is blunted by the pawn on d5, a very strong pawn chain. That bishop on e3 is restricted by its own pawn on d4. So unless the situation improves, those bishops aren't great. Black's knights look pretty good, they're nice and active. Connected rooks. Bishop looks good on a7. Could also switch to the other diagonal to b8. And I like black's pawn structure. Really solid. I mean, white has 3 pawns in front of the king. That can be useful defensively. Black only has 2 pawns in front of the king, but certainly white has no way of attacking the king at the moment. But all in all, yeah, because these bishops, they're not doing too much. I think I slightly prefer black's position here, actually. Rook d1. You can see that the rook just defends that pawn. And that frees the bishop, but doesn't got a great diagonal to go to. h6 played. Bishop e2. So Aronian is striving to bring the bishop to a better diagonal. And that could be of some concern to black. Rook e8. Black's piece is really well coordinated. Bishop d3. Now that's a better diagonal. It's a really intriguing battle. You know, we've had several games in the World Cup where there have been bishops battling against knights, and you know who's going to win out. And yeah, it's hard to tell actually. The knight is threatened, so it moved to h4, and that's quite menacing. You know, it can't be kicked away. Looks at those important squares. f3. Now that controls g4 and e4, so that rather restricts the knight on f6. And that's why it bounced round to h7. Or, well, it's going to bounce around here any moment via h7. So bishop b1, okay. Aronian is lining up some kind of battery on this diagonal. Knight g5. Well, Erigaisi has managed to maneuver these knights to really threatening positions. And it just feels like there's going to be some kind of sacrifice on f3 or h3. Queen c2 played. It's interesting. The computer wants white to play f4. It's such an ugly move somehow. But it's certainly very, very unclear. It's possible even to sacrifice a piece and come in with the queen. And you know, I'm not surprised that Aronian, I mean, who knows? I doubted whether he even considered this move. It just looks so ugly to kind of block in the bishop. Anyway, Queen c2 played, so that means that the queen can defend along the second rank sometimes, and also looks down that diagonal. In fact, Erigaisi played g6, blocking out the queen. Looks very natural. He played that after just over a minute. In fact, he could have taken here already. And not knight takes, but simply rook takes f3. Now, this looks really dangerous because white can check down here. In fact, there's no good follow-up. And in the meantime, this is threatened, as well as queen h3. So, well, black is better here. A missed chance. Anyway, g6, king h1, queen f7, shuffling over. So that covers here. Aronian is under pressure, but you know, there's pretty decent communication, a lot of pieces around the king, so should be okay for white. Bishop b8, yeah, this bishop isn't doing much directed against d4, so now it comes to this diagonal, and that's more sensitive. The knight dropped back. This is attacked. Again, you know, it must have been very tempting to play this move and then, let's say, g5, just to keep going, because it's difficult for white to sort of break out of this position, actually. I mean, maybe knight g3 is good, but anyway, it must be tempting. Must have been tempting. But Erigaisi kept things under control. Knight came back to f5. I mean, I certainly prefer black's position here to white's. Feels like black is creating too many threats on the king side. Bishop d2. Just getting the bishop out of the way of the knight. Bishop c7, that guarded this pawn. And knight e3. So Aronian very keen to exchange some pieces. King g7. And queen f1. So a lot of shuffling going on. I guess Aronian wants to bring his queen to d3 to try and tie black down to that g6 pawn. Right. What should black play now? Time for you to have a think. Time for me to have a drink. Cheers. Black to play. What would you do? Erigaisi just played rook e6. So that keeps an eye on g6 and prepares to double on the e-file. Very reasonable. But why not bishop takes h2? So this is the second time that a sacrifice was available, but he either overlooked it or thought he had something better. I think he overlooked this one. This seems pretty clear. So first things first, what about king takes bishop? Then there's rook takes bishop. And queen f4 check. Oops. So after king h1, queen takes rook. And black has just won a pawn. And a pretty safe pawn, I think. Okay, what else is there? Well, there's a tricky variation actually with bishop takes knight. Now, it's possible that he overlooked this move. Bishop g3. That's really subtle. And black is winning. Why is black winning? Well, okay, first of all, this bishop is attacked. Now, if it drops back, queen f6, followed by, whoops, queen h4 and queen h2. Okay, that's straightforward. Okay, so what about rook takes rook? Does this make a difference? Well, instead of recapturing here, pawn takes bishop is incredibly strong, even though at this moment black is a whole rook down. The attack on the h-file is just too strong. Problem is, this queen hasn't got a good square to go to. For example, queen d3, check here, and that's checkmate. There is no escape. So, well done if you spotted bishop takes h2. It's a really strong move, but not played. Rook e6 played. Bishop g1, and Aronian eager to exchange. And a3 could be that he's plotting b4. h5, but Erigaisi has some attack still on the king side. It's nice to gain a little bit of space in combination with this bishop and the knight. Queen f2, queen f4, another battery on the diagonal, and yeah, I mean simply h4 coming, and white is under pressure. Aronian played rook e1. Right. Your move again. Black to play. What are you going to do? I should flip it round, really. Black to play. Cheers. You have a think. I'll have a drink. Knight h3 is a winning move, and Erigaisi played it very quickly. Aronian had obviously miscalculated something. Maybe he thought that queen f1 was possible. First things first, what happens on pawn takes knight? Then rook takes rook. Queen f3 mate. What a beautiful finish. Notice how ineffective these bishops are. I think that's been a problem the whole game. Okay, so what about queen f1? Just withdrawing the queen. Oops, queen f1. Then knight takes bishop, so mate threatened. If queen takes, then rook takes rook. Queen is overloaded. Queen takes rook, queen takes pawn mate. And if g3, then you throw in rook takes rook. And after this, again, another Zwischenzug. Knight takes f3. So pawn takes, knight takes queen, black's a piece up, and check. Black is still a piece up. So knight h3 is just a knockout blow. And indeed, Levon Aronian was knocked out of the World Cup as he resigned in this position. I think a really interesting game. And I've come back to this idea of the bishops against the knights. Really, once it got to this position, actually, as I said before, white's bishops really aren't doing that much, whereas black's knights have immediate play on the king side, although Aronian redeployed the light square bishop. Well, let's get to this position. So it is doing something here. But actually black had that well covered. And this pawn is a permanent problem. It's potentially weak because it's isolated. And it simply blocks that bishop on d2, which really isn't doing that much. I know they're pointing quite nicely here. But, well, this is an interesting moment where here Aronian played knight e3. Actually, perhaps he should have just compromised and exchanged off one of the knights. So after this, knight e3 and the knight comes to g4. That's quite nice. And if pawn takes, queen h4. And here white is fighting back. You know, once the knight comes to g3, there are squares. So I think it was a mistake to just play with the two bishops, actually. In any case, really nice game from Erigaisi. Beautiful finish, although it was kind of curious that there was, I think, a fairly straightforward tactic earlier that he missed. You know, normally he's very, very sharp. Anyway, that meant that Arjun Erigaisi goes through. Let's take a look at who else went through. So Sindarov beat Svana. Sindarov is through. Yakabayev is through. Wei Yi defeated Samuel Sevian. And as we've seen, Erigaisi defeated Aronian. So we've got Erigaisi against Wei Yi. And, well, we've got some tiebreak games tomorrow, including Hari Krishna against Martinez. That's going to be really interesting. I'll catch up with events tomorrow, and I look forward to the next round. It's getting very tense indeed. Thanks for watching.